Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Mystery Theory podcast. Today I'm going to share part 3 of the Louise case disappearance. For those of you who haven't been following this series, I'm going to have part 1 and part 2 in the description box down below so you can catch up. But this is a different kind of, different style of video or case that I wanted to share with you guys because it goes behind the scenes and it shows how throughout an investigation there is a lot of things that need to be connected in order to form a theory of what really could have happened to somebody that, it's still an unsolved mystery, an unsolved murder or an unsolved disappearance. And it's just one of those things that I find that is not only interesting, but it's also helpful if I am going to do more cases in the future. I think that going through the process of a recent investigation, looking back in an older case, it really opened my eyes to see that sometimes we can be very quick to judge the police work or, the investigation part of the case, but it really does take a lot to go through the connections, the possibilities, and have an open mind to actually realize that, there's more out there. And if we can connect the dots, we can solve a mystery. In today's case, we are going to go a little bit deeper, and we have a new suspect and we have a new connection between a couple of suspects that at the end it's going to reveal where this new investigation believes that Louise K's body is at. This is the kind of thing that the families need when something terrible like this happens, even if it takes 30 years to know where exactly it is. So I just wanted to do this little introduction to let you know that if you are like me, maybe you'll need a pen and paper, and so you can keep popping out different names and make connections if you want to, because it really is intriguing and so very interesting to see how everything connects. And it's just something else. For those that are more straight to the point, maybe this is the kind of case that will be confusing to you because there's a lot of different names, and if you haven't been following the case, maybe you're kind of lost. There's 3 different suspects and how they are connected to the case. So all of that goes to say that this is going to be the most interesting part of this series, so I hope that you join me, and at the end you can share with me in the comments down below what you think that happened to Louise K. If you believe that after all this investigation her body is where the new investigation or the private investigator think that her body is, and if it will ever be found or not. So thank you for just bearing with me throughout this intro, and I'm going to leave you with the story and the last part of this podcast. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Mystery Theory podcast. I'm a little bit under the weather, so if there's a lot of cuts, that's probably why, but I didn't want to miss the part 3 this week of the Louise case disappearance. Remember that she went out for a night with her friends to a pub, and after that she decided to go spend the night in an area that she's done it many times before. The difference is that this time she never came back home, and her car also disappeared. So it was something very intriguing, but it was never solved at the time. She's still missing. So 30 years later, let's fast forward, a new investigation started with a private investigator and his team where they're trying to figure out the connection that, her disappearance might have with some of the serial killers in the area. So remember last time, the number 1 suspect and the one that the police had from the beginning in Louise K's disappearance was Peter Tobin. Now, we went through why the police believe that. Again, you have to catch up if you're not up to date with this. I have part 1 and part 2 on the channel, but the private investigator believed that Louise Kay is today buried in one of the addresses that they didn't dig. This guy, Peter Tobin, had 30 registered addresses all over the place. He went by 40 different aliases, so the police didn't really could trace him that much. And even when they had the 30 addresses, there was one of them that they didn't dig, and that remembered that his MO was killing these young ladies and then burying them in his backyards, which he's something else. But then when the investigator had enough information, they went to the new people that is renting that place where he believes that she's buried in. They said that they would not let him dig anything unless the police says to do it. He went to the police. The police said, no, we don't have enough evidence to just go and dig somebody's backyard, 30 years later, so we're not going to do it unless you find something else that we can use in order to kind of reopen this investigation and invest in digging in this new address that, according to the police, if you don't have the evidence that they want, it's basically a hunch and they're not going to go on that. So then the private investigator moved to the Glasgow area, where they found more unsolved cases. In particular, remember that we went through the Glasgow unsolved murders of Anna Kenny, Hilda McCauley, and Agnes Cooney, who all disappeared after a fun night out in a club, a pub, or a bar. Now, I went through all the details in part 2 of this series, so check that out if you missed it. But in those 3 murders, just to make a long story short, in the 3 murders, the victims were, they kind of shared the same killer's MO, which is that they went out to party on a weekend. They were strangled, they were gagged with their own clothes, and they were put in a remote location. So, but was this enough to say, okay, Peter Tobin did it? After a long investigation, the PI and his team decided that it didn't actually fit Peter Tobin. So they needed to keep digging and try to find other suspects that fitted the same kind of MO for those, and try to find the connection as well with what happened to Louise Kay. So this new suspect ended up being Angus Sinclair. I shared a lot of his life with you in the previous episode, and that includes the testimony of his wife of 10 years. Now, we're going to go through some of her interview today as well that wasn't revealed in the previous episode. So it's going to be interesting to learn a lot more about this guy. But at the end of the last episode, we ended up with the investigators placing Angus Sinclair or his vehicle, either or, in some cases both, in every crime scene of the Glasgow murder. So sadly, that's just not enough to convict a guy. So even though he did find out that he was in the area of every single crime scene that night when they died, and there are still witnesses 30 years later that can testify that, it is not enough. So he went through the record, and apparently in 2004, the police started an investigation to try to link or find a connection between the girls killed in Glasgow and Angus Sinclair. Okay, they knew that Angus probably had something to do with it, and again, witnesses and everything. But in 2004, they were trying to find a link. But they had over 1,138 female homicides over a 36-year period. But, over 1,000 female homicides, I mean, that's a lot. But only 6 of them that share something in common, including the killer's MO. The Edinburgh murders of Helen Scott and Christine Eady, and the Glasgow murders, the 3 girls that I already mentioned, and this new victim. So now there's 6 of them that share the same kind of MO of the killer. And again, we're going to go through one by one. Now, the new victim to us anyway was actually the first one. And her name was Frances Barker. She was 37 years old, and she worked as a baker. She was the youngest daughter, and she loved her job. And according to her sister-in-law, she described her as a lovely lady. Apparently, Frances went out. It was rare that she went out, according to her sister-in-law, but that night she decided to go out with her sister, Bridget. And this was on June 10th, 1977. They had a few drinks, and then she decided to go back home. Sadly, and this is something that sometimes you kind of wonder, was this fate? Was this meant to be? You don't want to think that kind of stuff, but she takes her sister coat instead of hers. According to what I've seen, it was by mistake. I don't know if they had something that was very similar. I don't know how that happened, but apparently she took her sister's coat. So when she got home, she looked inside her pocket and she was missing her keys. And that's where she realized that her coat was at the bar and that she needed to go back and get it because her husband or her partner was not home or in her apartment, and that she wasn't going to be able to get in. So this is just assuming, because that would be the likely scenario, because after she left the bar and she arrived home, she was never seen again. So people assume that she wanted to go back to the bar and exchange the coat so she can get her keys, and probably they believe that she probably tried to get a taxi too that would take her there. Now, remember that at this point, if you've been following this case, Angus Sinclair was the kind of guy that was roaming around giving rides to people. I mean, that's what he liked to do. So, the saddest part of the story is that at the time, Angus Sinclair, he lived in another area with his wife, but at that particular night and in that period of time, he was in that neighborhood, and I'll explain why. Now, the next day, she didn't show up for work, and Frances, that's what I mean, that didn't show up for work, and her body was later found 2 weeks in Glenboig, which is it's kind of the outskirts of Glasgow. A farmer found her body exactly 14 miles away from her home. That is the area, and coincidentally, which I don't believe in coincidences, but that was the area where they found Anna's body later. That hadn't happened yet. This was the very first one. And but later on, we will find Anna's body in that very same spot. I think it's about, I don't know if yards away or, it wasn't that far away from where later on she was found there. Now, Frances' body was found naked from the waist down. She was strangled, gagged with her own clothes, and with her hands tied. It was very, very similar of what it's going to be the Glasgow murders later on. The interesting part is that there was somebody in jail for her murder, okay? So this is the first murder, and somebody was convicted for her murder, even though we are reinvestigating this thing because we believe that whoever killed Frances probably killed the Glasgow girls, and they also, it's all connected and it will round and just go back to Louise' case. Now, Thomas Ross Young, he was labeled as a dangerous individual by the police. He was something that they said, it was a lorry driver, which I had to Google it, and it says it's a truck driver. And he happened to be a sex offender and involved in violent rapes. So he was no saint. The police knew it and suspected of him right away. But the evidence against his, in my opinion, it's kind of weak and could have been planted after all. I mean, we'll go into the details, but after convicting the guy, the murders with the similar MO continued. Weird, right? Because if apparently you got the guy, why are they continue to happen? I mean, it's kind of weird. But they continue over a period of 6 months or so. Now, let's go back into his life. This guy loved to mess with prostitutes, and I'm talking about Thomas Ross Young here, the one that was convicted for Frances' murder. And a few weeks before Frances was killed, he assaulted a prostitute in the same area of Glenboig. This is, again, near where weeks later, Frances' body would have been found. So that is the number one reason why the police believe that he did it. Maybe it was an assault that went wrong, but it's kind of weird because he didn't mind leaving them alive, you know? This guy had a history of, sex offender and rape and everything, but he just didn't kill them. He would do that and just leave them there. So it would be kind of interesting to see that the guy was escalating, but it's not impossible. And another thing that is kind of interesting is if in fact Thomas Ross Young was the one that killed Frances. Frances wasn't a prostitute, so that wouldn't fit really the kind of people that he hung around with. Now, when they looked for him to arrest him because of that hunch the police had, and that he abused somebody nearby a weeks before, and because of his criminal history, they went to go arrest him. Which, by the way, it's kind of interesting because I don't know if you have enough to arrest a guy based on the idea that he assaulted another girl weeks before. And I'm not saying that they were wrong. I'm just saying that that's all they had at that point. But when they went into his house, he was hiding under his floorboards. There's like a little crawl space area under the floor. It's not even a basement. It's something under the floor. And he was hiding there. But when they found him, they pulled him up and went into that area. And according to the police, they quote unquote found a makeup mirror and 3 buttons that, according to the police, belonged to Frances. So now they not only had the hunch that, he did something a few weeks earlier in that same area, now they have the proof that he did it. And again, that it's something that they found once they pull him out. That we'll go back to that. But after questioning him for hours, he said that he might have killed her, but he never confessed. He never said, this is what I did and this is her and, this is what happened. He was convicted for murder, but he immediately appealed. And according to his lawyer, because, the items that they found were in his home, he wasn't even there. He keeps saying that those things were planted by the police, who had a hunch that he might have done it. Sadly, and again, this wasn't an amazing human being, but he died in 2014 while still in jail. And it's sad because it's kind of hard now to see if they're never going to reopen this case, so they're never going to try to see if he actually was the one who killed Frances or not. But in our record, that's who he did. That's who did it. Now, he is connected somehow to the murder scene and the abuse of women. So now the investigators are trying to put together an idea or scenario where Angus Sinclair and Thomas Ross Young may have worked together. Okay, this is something that is very out there, but the police really needed to find a connection between this guy Thomas and Angus. They had to have something, and there were a lot of things that were pointing to that direction. So the private investigator decided that he was going to go visit again Sarah, the wife of Angus Sinclair, and they asked, do you know a Thomas? Have he ever brought somebody by that name? Or do you know who this guy is? And she said, no. I've been with him, or I was with him for 10 years. And never heard of that guy. But she said that Angus was very, very well known in the Glenboyd area, and that he spent a lot of time there because he knew that area so well. He loved to go, and he had friends there, and he would go to pubs and stuff like that. And she also said that was especially around that year 1977. So now we can put him there, but I mean, were they friends? Because the police did investigate and they couldn't find a link. But now recently the investigator interviewed 2 witnesses, and they told them they told him that they would go out a night with him. They had drinks, they went to local pubs. I mean, yes, in fact, what the wife was saying is true. Was true, and he was frequenting this area where, oddly enough, the bodies started to show up later on. Now, one of the witnesses also said that he had a scrapyard, and that when Angus bought the caravanette, remember we talked about this kind of camper van that he bought, he would let him park there overnight. So this caravanette somehow was kind of hiding in the area by one of his friends. His friend probably had no idea what he was doing or what he was planning to do, but we do know that he bought the caravanette 11 days after Francis was murdered. So this means that maybe he was friends with Thomas and they were riding the truck that Thomas was driving for work. It could have been that, and maybe they moved on to something smaller like the caravanette. Now, just so you know, and this is why it's very important, the scrapyard thought the area let me go back. That scrapyard was in the same area. I mean, it was actually a mile away from where Francis' body was found. So yeah, I mean, that is the area that Thomas took the prostitute and abused her and left her there, and then Francis' body was found there, and then now all of a sudden Angus was parking his van in that area as well. Now, when the investigator recently asked Angus' wives about Sarah, about the night that Francis disappeared, well, oddly enough, Sarah remembers that they had a huge fight and that she kicked him out. Apparently he was having an affair, and Sarah didn't want to continue to put up with him, so she remembers that they had a huge fight. She remembers that clearly, and when he left the house, he had, with his wife, of course, he moved to his mom's house. And guess what? The mom's house is in the west part of Glasgow, specifically in Maryhill Road, which is a few blocks away from where Francis lived. Same street, just down the road. So, I mean, there's a lot of things connecting the dots right now, and it's kind of taking us somewhere. Coincidentally, he was in the area when Francis disappeared because they had that huge fight, and he was going to his mom's house to spend the night there. So maybe when Francis was dropped off by the taxi at her house, he was walking by or driving by with Thomas. We don't know, but we have proof that he was in the area. The police back then again entertained that idea, but they just couldn't find any evidence, so they dropped it very, very quickly, the idea that they were friends. Now, recently, the investigation team they wanted to go back and try to research if in the past Angus had been teaming up with anybody to commit crimes. And they found the first one, okay? I mean, this guy was not only a criminal, but this Angus was very persuasive to get away with what he wanted. In the year 1970, so this was 7 years before the murders, he had a friend. His name was Eddie Colatongo, I'm going to call him Eddie because otherwise I'm going to butcher his last name way too many times. But he was a local pornographer, not a photographer, a pornographer. And he would pay Angus to go find him girls. And in exchange, along with money, of course, he also showed Angus how to develop pictures in black and white, which is something that he did at his mom's house. And I'm talking about Angus doing that in his mom's house. Now, later on, 1979, Eddie was murdered. And guess what? It's still an unsolved murder. But it gets better. Angus told his wife that the police was going to go question her because he actually knew the guy that died, and he asked her that she would just say that he was home with her to avoid any misunderstandings. So he was obviously trying to cover all his bases, and he knew, the wife knew that something was up because there was also some jewelry missing from the crime scene where Eddie's body was found. And coincidentally, Angus showed up at home with jewelry that night. So while Thomas was still in jail, they decided to go and ask him about Angus, if he knew him, and he said that even if he did, he wouldn't tell them. So the police, there were a lot of things that were connecting, but they still couldn't let them talk or make them talk. When they asked Angus about Thomas, and he just didn't say anything. Nothing at all. He didn't speak. He didn't deny anything. Now, there are other examples of how Angus would recruit people to do what he wanted. Another one is that in 1976, a year before the Glasgow murders, Angus was and another guy broke in an apartment. They kind of not really broke in, but they knocked the door and a little girl opened. When they got in, they tried to keep her quiet. They went and wake up the dad. They tied them, and they were gagged with their own clothing, and they were bound. And apparently the guys had socks over their heads, those kind of sheer ones. But the little girl, she did give a description afterwards saying that there was a small guy with dark hair. And now, later on, we do know that it was finally Angus, but at the time, nobody knew who he was. The idea was that they wanted to wait for the guy that was coming for the rent money, and that's what they did. They didn't kill anybody, but they just took the money from the guy collecting the rent. Not too much money, but just enough for a couple of thieves. A man, years later, decided to go and confess to do it. He said that he did it because he was helping Angus Sinclair, and that actually Angus persuaded him to do it. He didn't want to do it. Now, if you want to know who this guy is, and the second accomplice for doing all these things that Angus was doing is David Hamilton, Sarah's brother. According to Sarah, he was way younger and probably influenced by Angus to do it. Now, just to make a third partner in crime, just to find a third partner in crime, and again, the investigation is kind of taking place in connecting things to find enough evidence to continue, because it really needs to connect in order to make sense and in order to be a cohesive investigation. So now they found a third partner that he had, and this time it was the police knew that they were working together because they found DNA from Angus, and they did find DNA from another person in the crime scene of Christine, Eddie, and Helen Scott in 1977. Remember, these were two 17-year-old girls that went out for the night, and they ended up dying in, I don't know, but I want to say 20 years later or 30 years later, they did some kind of DNA test, and that's how they ended up finding the DNA of Angus and arresting him for it. But this was, I think it was 30 or 36 years later. I can't really remember the date, but you know what I mean. It was, they found his DNA, and that's why they could pin it to him. But they also find another DNA sample, and this was from Gordon Hamilton, which, yeah, you guessed it right. It was Sarah's other brother, the older brother. Now, Gordon had a clean record, no friendship with Angus that Sarah could recall, but he managed to place Gordon in the same place with him and with the 17-year-old that ended up dead. Gordon and David, they probably cooperated with the police, so they were never persecuted. And today, they're both dead, according to their sister Sarah. And she completely believes that they were manipulated by Angus to do what he wanted to do. So now the investigation proves that he did have accomplices, okay? So all of that it just goes to show the police that he did work with other people, and that it's possible that Angus and Thomas were working together the night, or the night that Frances died, and kind of relating Angus to the rest of the murders that happened while Thomas was in jail. So another lead comes up at this point, and this is a guy that says that he knew Angus in the year 1977. Apparently he was this guy that came out of nowhere, said that he was renting a room in a house with 6 bedrooms, and that the landlord, his name was Billy Welsh, in which, of course, given names and stuff like that, it kind of make it more legitimate. But they were really good friends. Apparently Angus and Thomas were really good friends with Billy, and they were living at some point they were living in the house that he owned. And just to make things worse, the house was in Kirkland Street, which is really close to Frances and Angus's mom's house. So just, to make things worse, apparently the guys were just sharing, or they were spending a lot of time at this Billy Welsh's address or place or house. Now, the witness also said that Angus said that he was a taxi driver and that he was very, very creepy. That's all that we can get from that witness that came forward. They tried to trace the landlord, but they just couldn't. They did find his girlfriend at the time, and she said that she knew that Thomas and Angus lived there, actually, in the house. But they lived before Billy started dating her, and so she just didn't know them very well. Remember that years and years later, they would test the DNA to go for in the crime scene of Christine and Helen, and that's why he got it. But now, before that happened, and before he actually went to jail for those, he ended up being arrested for sexually assaulting kids. And I'm talking about Angus, okay? He confessed to his wife that he was abusing kids, and he said that he didn't know how many, and that if she would bring a list of names, he could say which ones he did and which one he didn't. In 2007, okay, so this guy, okay, that was in 1982. So he did he did go to jail for those things that he did. The raping and abusing kids and stuff like that. But then, of course, he was later on found guilty of, or they found his DNA in the crime scene of Christine and Helen. But in 2007, this guy was acquitted for the charges. And I don't know how that happened. That sounds very, very fishy. That sounds very, very weird. But apparently in 2008, he slipped, and he told a friend in prison who happened to know a journalist that he was very worried about a car that the police could find very easily, and that he got rid of the car in 1978, which kind of connects us back to what happened to Louise K. So the police, the friend, quote unquote friend of Angus, told the journalist. The journalist told the police, and the police traced the vehicle to a quarry that is a mile away from where Frances' body was found 2 decades later. So inside the car, they found a child's jacket with some sort of bounding handcuff homemade thing, just like the girls had in the Glasgow murders in 1977. So now it's even looking a little bit more suspicious. So at this point, this investigation, it kind of goes to show us that there's a few things that came out of this investigation that started with Louise K's disappearance, and now it's kind of taken its own life. It's kind of unbelievable. We learned that Angus Sinclair preyed on women. girls and kids in general, that Angus and Thomas lived together at some time in the same house, and that they probably knew Frances. Maybe they were even neighborly faces. So maybe they went by, she knew that they were neighbors. Maybe she accepted a ride. We know all this information because of this investigation. That witnesses, also we know that witnesses place Angus or himself or his vehicle in every crime scene of Hilda McCauley, Anna Kenny, and Agnes Cooney. So 6 murders connected, unsolved, and still missing Louise Kay. But with all this new evidence, we can hope that the police, now having more to go on, can do something and finally dig Peter Tomin's ex-home and see if Louise is there. But now, thank you to Louise and all this investigation that was taking and leading us to all this kind of different places. Maybe now Frances, Hilda, Anna, Agnes, Helen, and Christine's deaths will be solved. And this time for good, in connecting the pieces and trying to find who was responsible for all these unsolved murders that really deserve to be solved. They deserve justice. So the family and the investigator, going back to Louise Kay, they do believe that Peter Tomin was the one who had something to do with her disappearance. They believe that he knows exactly where she is and maybe is in his old backyard. But now we have more evidence and we have a lot more information that to give to the police and kind of hope that they would dig and make sure that she's not there. If she is there, it would be a shame that the police didn't want to dig the backyard, just not so they don't ruin somebody else's backyard. It really would suck if that happened. But I feel like, this investigation started in one way and then ended up connecting all the dots. Maybe this, last 2 episodes with all these unsolved murders and all these girls dying and disappearing, and, maybe they had nothing to do with what happened to Louise. But just because of Louise, just because of her unique case and her unique circumstances, it really helped this investigation to take them into all kinds of different places and find out that maybe they already know where Louise is. Maybe she is there, in that backyard. But they also help another set of girls that really deserve justice. And that's why I felt like this was one of those cases that is not only shining light into what happened to a young girl 30 years ago, but it's also shining some light in other cases that deserve justice. It really broke my heart at the end of the documentary to see the parents of all these girls that disappeared. And one in particular, there's a couple, the sweet grandpa and grandma right now that, every time they talk about their little girl, they just can't believe that the police didn't. It's just I think her death was under some kind of weird circumstances. They didn't say that it was foul play or, And so they're like, how can they say it wasn't? When clearly it was. There's all the evidence out there. And now we just have to live with the idea that she's not here anymore. And we need to be okay with the idea that we might never find out. So I'm glad that this investigation brought some light to that too. And I hope that they get the answers that they deserve. That every single human being deserves, no matter what. Thank you so much for following along this investigation and this series of things that are kind of a clue game where we're trying to follow one and then the other one, then the other one. But it kind of helps us, or helps me understand how the process is and how sometimes they can make mistakes. and how we have to preserve the evidence. So in years to come, we may have more advance in technology and how we can do better, and how we can just go back and try to find whoever was responsible, no matter how old the case is. Everyone deserves justice. Thank you so much for watching this video, for listening to this story, and for staying tuned. It's just one of those things that sometimes these longer stories are not for everyone, but I thought it was interesting enough for those of you who truly enjoy the process of the investigation and how to connect the dots, and the amount of work that it really takes to unsolve a case, even if it takes 30 years to find an answer. So thank you so much for being there. If you want to watch more podcasts, I'll have a playlist in the description box down below that you can check that out. If you want to keep in touch with me, I will also leave my Patreon in the description box down below. Thank you so much to the new patrons. I remember Nick, it's one of them, but there is a couple of more that I hopefully added into the intro of this. So thank you so much for becoming part of the Patreon family. I love to keep in touch with you guys. Either I have some vlogs, some have extra content depending the tier that you choose to be part of, and I really appreciate if you take the time to check that out. If not, no hard feelings, I will be here. But thank you so much for all the patrons that make this weekly upload possible. See you back on Friday.